What if a man gave away the one good thing he owned, his father's own horse, to a stranger's daughter he had never spoken to, and by the turning of one long winter, he found himself standing before a fire that was not his own, being called something he never dreamed to be called? What if the very thing a whole town laughed at him for losing became the road that carried him home to a family bigger than the one the fever had taken? Folks in that part of the Arizona territory told this story for 50 years after, and they never told it the same way twice, but every one of them ended it the same. Because what the chief called him by spring became a legend. If you like stories where kindness costs a man everything and gives him back more than he lost, do me a small kindness of your own and tap that like button, subscribe to Saddleback Stories, and ring the notification bell so the next tale finds you by the fire. Now, ride back with me to the Arizona territory of 1884, where the mountains turn purple at dusk and the springs hide themselves among the rocks like secrets. And let's begin. It was a hard country then, and it made hard rules for the people who tried to live in it. The ranchers had come with their wagons and their Bibles and their fences, and they had staked out the low valleys where the grass grew, and they had learned to fear the ridgelines where the Apache still rode, and the Apache had learned to fear the smoke of the new chimneys, and so the two peoples lived side by side the way two bulls live in neighboring pastures, watching over the rails, never crossing, remembering old blood. There had been raids in the years before, and there had been killings on both sides that no one had paid for, and the memory of those things lay over the valley like the smell of a grass fire long after the flames are out. The town of Cottonwood Bend sat where two dry washes met, a church and a mercantile, and a livery, and a scatter of houses leaning together against the bigness of the land. And the men who gathered on its porch in the evenings spoke of the Apache the way children speak of wolves, with their voices low and their eyes on the hills, telling and retelling the old bad stories until the stories grew teeth they had never had. Most folks kept to the rule the country had made. They did not trade across the line. They did not ride alone past the last fence. And they taught their sons that a man's safety lay in staying with his own kind, and that the surest way to lose your hair was to forget it. But there were a few, here and there, scattered thin as good water in a dry year, who would not accept that the line drawn by fear was the same as the line drawn by God, and who believed that a man was a man, and a neighbor was a neighbor, no matter what tongue he prayed in, or what color the sun had made him. They were mostly poor, these few, and mostly quiet, and mostly laughed at, and it is with one of them that our story rightly begins, on a modest ranch at the foot of the eastern ridge where the cottonwoods leaned over a thin creek, and a young man worked his land alone. His name was Eli Hartwell, and he was 29 years old that spring, though the sun and the labor had put 10 more years on his hands than the calendar allowed. He had come to the ranch as a boy behind his father's wagon, a skinny thing with his whole life ahead of him and his mother singing on the seat, and he had buried both his mother and his father on the little rise above the creek within the same hard winter 3 years back, when the fever came through the valley and took the strong along with the weak and did not bother to explain itself. He had dug those two graves himself in ground so cold it rang under the pick like iron, and he had said the words over them out of the family Bible with no one else to hear, and something in him had gone quiet in that winter and had stayed quiet since. He worked the place by himself now, 160 stubborn acres of rock and mesquite, and a little good grass down by the water, and he had made it feed him, barely, the way a man makes a poor field feed him by loving it more than it deserves. He was quiet by nature and quieter by grief, and he judged a man not by where he came from, but by how he carried himself, whether he kept his word and paid his debts and looked you in the eye when he spoke. And this had earned him a reputation in Cottonwood Bend that was not entirely kind. Too trusting, the men on the mercantile porch called him that Hartwell boy, too soft for this country, and they said it half in pity and half in warning, the way you talk about a fellow you expect to find face down in a wash someday. He owned little enough that was worth the talk. His cabin was one room with a dirt floor his mother had once meant to plank. His herd was a dozen lean cattle that he knew by name and temper, and his plow was older than he was and mended in 3 places. But he owned one thing that was fine, one thing that made even the men who mocked him fall silent when it passed, and that was a horse. A buckskin gelding, deep gold with a black mane and legs like carved oak, sound in wind and limb and gentle as a summer morning, and Eli's father had caught him wild off the flats and broken him with his own patient hands in the last good year of his life, gentling him with sugar and soft words over long weeks. And when the horse was made, the old man had put the lead rope in Eli's palm and said, "This one's yours, son. Mind him well." That horse was the last warm thing his father's hands had ever made, and Eli loved him past all sense. And there was not money enough in the whole territory to buy him. Now up in the high country, among the people who camped along the cold streams of the Chiricahua slopes, where the pines stood black against the snow, there lived a young woman named Naish, which in the tongue of her people meant something close to mischief maker, a name her mother had given her for the light in her as a child, and which she had never quite grown out of. She was the daughter of the chief, a man named Tisela, whom the whole band honored for his long memory and his slow anger and his fairness, a man who was said to weigh a matter a full day before he spoke on it, and then to speak but once. Naish had been raised in the saddle and among the horses and in the shade of the herb-gathering women, so that by the time she was grown, there was no one in the band who could gentle a frightened colt faster or find the right route for a fever quicker than she could, and the old women said she had hands that the animals trusted the moment they felt them. She was proud, the way a straight pine is proud, not from vanity, but from being exactly what she was, without apology. And she was calm, in the way of people who have decided early what they will and will not fear. She had seen the ranchers' fences crawl up the valley her whole life, one strand of wire at a time. And she had lost an uncle in the bad years to a white man's bullet that no one had ever answered for. And yet she carried no bitterness in her, for her father had taught her that hatred is a horse that throws every rider in the end, and she had watched enough bitter souls eat themselves hollow to believe him. It happened that late one afternoon, with a cold front sliding down off the mountains and the light already going thin and gray, Naish was far from her people, down near the edge of the low country, where she had gone to gather a certain root that grew only by the springs, and with her was her grandmother, old and frail and burning with a fever that had come on sudden that morning and would not break. They had come down on a single spotted mare, riding double and slow, and as they turned back toward the high camp with the sky darkening and the first hard flakes beginning to spit sideways on the wind, the mare put a hoof wrong on the loose shale of a washbank and went down screaming with a foreleg snapped clean below the knee, and there was nothing to be done for her but what mercy required. And Naish did that hard thing with her own knife and her own tears, kneeling in the cold beside the animal she had raised from a foal. And then she stood alone in the falling dark, miles from her people, with a sick old woman who could not walk wrapped shivering on the ground, and a cold coming down out of the mountains that would kill them both before morning, as surely as any enemy. Eli found them because he had ridden out in the last hour of light to look for a strayed heifer, and he had heard the mare's death cry carry thin and terrible across the flats, and he had turned the buckskin toward the sound against his own better judgment, and he came up on the wash in the last blue light with the snow starting to stick, and he saw the whole of it in a single glance. The dead horse cooling on the shale, the old woman shivering on the ground half wrapped in a thin trade blanket, and the young woman standing over her with her knife still wet and her chin up, and her black eyes daring him to be one more danger in a day that had already emptied its worst upon her. He knew who they were. He could not have told you the names, but he knew by the beadwork on the girl's dress and the cut of the buckskin and the set of her shoulders that these were Apache from the high band, the very people the whole valley had taught him since boyhood to fear above wolves and weather. And he felt that old fear move in him the way it would move in any man raised on those stories. His hand even went toward the rifle in its scabbard, out of habit, before his eyes had finished their work, and then he looked at the old woman's gray face and the racking shudder that went through her, and at the young woman's cracked and bleeding hands, and at the snow already gathering in the dead mare's mane. And he understood in that moment that fear was a luxury for people who were warm and safe, and that he was neither so cruel nor so cold as to leave two women to freeze because his neighbors had taught him to. And he got down off the buckskin without another thought and let his hand fall away from the rifle for good. He did not speak much, for there was little language between them, but kindness has a grammar all its own that needs no words, and he showed them with his open hands what he meant to do. He knelt and lifted the grandmother, light as a bundle of dry, kindling in his arms, and he settled her up into his own saddle, onto the broad, warm back of the golden horse his father had broken, the one fine thing he owned in all the wide world, and he stripped off his own heavy coat and wrapped it close around the old woman's thin shoulders and tucked it under her, and then he put the reins into Naishi's hand and pointed her toward the high country where her people were and made her understand with his eyes and his hands that the horse was sound and sure-footed and would carry them both and would not fail her in the dark. And Naish looked at him a long, searching moment, this quiet, coatless rancher standing there in the driving snow, giving away the animal any fool alive could see was the best and dearest thing he had. And she did not have words for him any more than he had for her, but she pressed her open hand flat against her own heart and then held it out toward him, palm up, in the oldest gesture there is. And he nodded once, and she gathered the reins and turned the horse up the mountain and was gone into the white. And Eli Hartwell turned in the deepening dark and walked home. It was 8 miles by the wash and the flats, 8 miles he had ridden 100 careless times in a lazy hour with the sun on his back, and that night it took him the better part of 6, on foot, in his shirt sleeves, with the snow coming harder now and thicker, and the wind off the mountain finding every gap and seam in his thin clothes as if it were a living thing looking with cold fingers for the way to his heart. His boots were made for the stirrup and not for the ground, high-heeled and smooth-soled, and within the first mile they had filled with snow that melted against his skin and then froze there, so that his feet went from aching to burning to nothing at all, and it was the nothing at all that frightened him worse than the burning had. For a man who has wintered in that high country knows well enough that nothing at all is how the cold first begins to win. He kept his hands jammed hard up under his arms and his chin tucked down against his chest, and he walked, and where the drifts lay deep in the low places, between the rises he broke them with his shins and his knees, and did not let himself stop even to catch his breath, because he knew with a plain animal certainty that if he sat down to rest just once in the soft lee of a rock, just for a moment, he would not get up again, and they would find him come the spring thaw curled up small as a sleeping child not a mile from his own front gate. So he talked to himself out loud to stay awake and moving, foolish scraps of talk, the names of his cattle, the words over his parents' graves, and he talked to his father as if the old man were walking the flats beside him, and once, past the halfway point, he thought he heard the buckskin's familiar hoofbeats coming up behind him on the crust, and he turned with his heart leaping up, both hoping and dreading. But it was only the wind working in a black stand of dead sage. He came at last to his own cold, dark cabin, somewhere past the middle of the night, and his fingers had gone so stiff and clumsy that he could not make them strike a match for the longest while, fumbling and dropping them on the hearth in the dark, and when at last the fire caught and climbed, he sat down hard before it and thawed. And the feeling came creeping back into his hands and his feet like 1,000 hot needles driven in slow, and he wept a little there in the firelight from the sheer animal pain of it, and from something else besides that he could not have named, and the stall out behind the cabin stood empty and quiet in the snow. But he did not once let himself regret the horse. Not that night, and not after, because a thing that is right does not stop being right just because it costs you dear or leaves you cold, and he had asked nothing back for it. Not payment, not thanks, not even that any living soul should ever know what he had done. But of course they knew, because a town like Cottonwood Bend is a still pond, and the smallest stone dropped in it makes rings that reach every shore before the water settles. It was the liveryman who noticed first that the Hartwell boy came in on foot for his week's supplies, walking stiff and careful and favoring feet that had not yet forgiven him their frostbite. And it was a freighter who had passed a coatless man walking the flats in the snow that spitting evening who put the last of the pieces together over a whiskey. And by the second Sunday, the whole valley had the story in its mouth, and had bent it and worn it into the shape that suited it best. "Did you hear?" they said on the mercantile porch with their thumbs in their braces. The Hartwell boy gave his good buckskin clean away, gave it to an Apache, a squaw, and some old crone he found out in the snow, just handed over the best horse in the whole county, and turned around and walked home like a beggar with holes in his boots. And they laughed, some of them, the hard-barking laugh men, used to cover the thing in themselves they are afraid to look at square. And they shook their heads and slapped their knees and said it was just exactly what they had always known about that boy. Too trusting, too soft, and now too plain foolish to hold on to the one good asset that might have carried him through a hard year alive. They said the horse was surely lost to him, for good and always. That no Apache from here to the border would ever in this life bring a white man's horse back to him, and that Eli Hartwell had as good as burned $150 hard dollars just to warm two strangers he would never see again. A neighbor of his named Fen, a heavy-set prosperous man with a good deep-watered herd and a small pinched soul, rode all the way out to the Hartwell Place special one afternoon to tell Eli to his face what a God-blessed fool he had made of himself, and then, softening it the way such men always do when they come to the point, offered to ride up and buy the buckskin back off the Indians himself, cheap, before it was wasted and ruined on people who wouldn't know a fine horse from a mule, and to sell it on down the valley and split the difference between them fair, and he seemed genuinely and honestly puzzled when Eli only looked at him steady and said that the horse was right where it needed to be, and there was nothing to buy back. Fen rode off shaking his head and muttering that the fever 3 years back must have taken more of the boy's sense than anybody had reckoned, and the story hardened in the town's mouth into a kind of tidy parable that the mothers told the children about the plain danger of trusting the wrong sort of people, and Eli let it harden and did nothing to soften it. He did not argue, and he did not explain himself to a single living soul, for he had learned long ago that there are some things you cannot make people understand until they are ready, and no amount of talk will hurry that day along. So, he went on quietly with his work, thinner that winter for the lack of a good horse under him, and slower afoot across his own broad acres, and he told himself the account was square and closed, and that he expected nothing more to come of it. He was wrong about that, though, for the account was not square at all, not by the long, careful reckoning of the people up on the mountain. The old woman he had wrapped in his own coat had lived, warmed and doctored and pulled back from the very edge through that first killing night by the same high fire she would have died a mile short of, and the young woman he had lifted up onto his horse was none other than the daughter of Chief Sella himself, and the fevered grandmother was the chief's own aged mother, the eldest and most honored soul in all the band, the keeper of its oldest stories, so that the coatless stranger freezing in the snow had, without ever knowing it, and without wanting one thing in return. Gone and saved the two people the chief loved best in all the world. And Selah was not a man who let such a debt lie unanswered in the dust. But he was also a deeply wise man, and wisdom is nothing if it is not patient, and so he did not come storming down out of the mountains with gifts and speeches, all in the first flush of his gratitude. For he wished first to know with certainty what manner of man this rancher truly was, whether the great kindness had been only a single strange warm gust that would not come again, or whether it was the steady settled weather of a genuinely good heart. And so, it was the horse that came back to Eli first, before anything else. On a clear cold morning a full week after the snow had stopped, Eli looked up from mending a rail on his corral and saw his father's golden buckskin standing quiet at the gate, sleek and well-fed and brushed until his gold coat threw the low sun straight back, and up on his back, sitting straight and calm as if she had every right in the world to be there, was Naish, come down the mountain alone to return what had been lent to her in the dark. She did not keep the horse, though the whole valley had sworn up and down that she would, and that plain fact told Eli something true about her, and he for his part did not act surprised to see it come back, and did not make any fuss or fumble for words of thanks, and that told her something true about him in return. She had a small handful of English words, and he had fewer of hers, and between the two of them they built a rough swaying bridge of gesture, and pointing, and slow repetition, and she made him understand at last that the grandmother lived, and was mending well, and was grateful past the saying of it, and he made her understand that this gladdened him. And then she did a thing that quietly undid the whole town's careful story in a single stroke. She swung down off the horse and put the reins back in his hand, and then instead of turning up the mountain she stayed, an hour and then two, walking his poor pastures with a born horsewoman's narrow eye, and she showed him with her hands and her few words where his water was running to waste, and which of his lean cows was sickening at the lungs, and what root pulled from what ground would mend it. And then she came back. That, more than anything, is the true beating heart of that whole long winter, that she came back, and then came back again, week upon week, as the cold months wore slowly on, sometimes bearing the grandmother's thanks pressed shyly into his hands in the shape of dried venison or a braided cord of horsehair, and sometimes bringing only herself and her sharp eye and her patient healing hands. She showed him one gray lowering afternoon that the little creek his whole place depended on had begun to cut and gnaw at its own soft bank on the bend above the pasture, bleeding fully half its good water sideways down into a hidden sink of gravel where it did no living thing any good at all. And she walked the whole muddy length of it with him, pointing and explaining, and showed him where a low patient wall of stacked stone would turn the water back and hold it true in its proper channel where his grass could drink. And they built that wall together over 3 hard cold days, the two of them hauling flat stones up from the wash and fitting them close by hand with the wind off the peaks numbing their fingers, working easy in the way of two people who keep the same rhythm without trying. And when it was done, the water ran back sweet and full into the good pasture, just exactly as she had promised him it would. And I will tell you it turns that same water to this very day. She taught him across those weeks to read the flick of a horse's ear and the white rim of a cow's eye the way her own people read them, quick and sure. And she showed him which of the gray weeds growing unregarded on his own land were medicine, and which were slow poison, and where to find the small hidden green places tucked in the folds of the near slope where a beast could still find a mouthful in the leanest starving heart of winter. And he was not a man to take and give nothing back. Poor as he was, so he found what he had to offer her, a way of splicing a rope so the join would never slip, a store of good coffee that he shared out to the very last precious bean, the loan of his one good axe when her peoples had gone dull. Bit by slow bit, he taught his stiff tongue enough of her language to say more than his hands alone could carry, and she learned enough of his, and their talk grew up out of bare need into something far easier and warmer, into the small, foolish, unimportant talk of two people who have started, without ever quite deciding to watch the rise for the first sight of one another coming. He took to riding the buckskin up the near slopes to meet her halfway on her road down, so that the very horse his father had broken and gentled became a living thing that crossed the invisible line the whole valley so feared, carrying a rancher up the mountain and an Apache woman down it, day after day, back and forth across that hard old fence of fear, until the crossing wore a real and visible path into the winter grass. And over all those cold shortening and then lengthening months, with the patient horse standing between them and the white mountains hanging above and the days imperceptibly stretching toward the light, a silent, mutual respect grew and deepened quietly into something a good deal warmer, and neither one of them ever spoke its name aloud, but the both of them knew it just the same. It was not an easy or a smooth thing, this warming, and I will not stand here and tell it to you as though it were, for there were two hard winds blowing steady against the two of them, and they had no choice but to walk straight into both at once. Down in the town, the lazy gossip about the foolish, soft-hearted Hartwell boy curdled and soured into something a great deal meaner the moment folks began to see that the horse had come back after all, and that the rancher was now riding up into the forbidden high country of his own free and open will. There were hard men in Cottonwood Bend who muttered over their whiskey that Hartwell had gone plain over to the other side, that he was no longer a man to be trusted at your back or in your branding pen, that a fellow who kept such close company with the Apache was himself a standing danger to honest Christian people, and there came one particular Sunday when the preacher had to be quietly talked down off a fiery sermon he had prepared that named no names, but surely needed none for any soul in those pews to know just who was meant. Old Fen took to crossing the road when he saw Eli coming, and up on the mountain, if the truth be told, it was no easier going, for there were old men in the band, elders with long memories and longer griefs, who could still name the uncle killed dead in the bad years, and who had watched the barbed fences crawl one wire at a time up the valley that had been their father's hunting ground, and these men looked upon the rancher's steady visits with cold, flat eyes, and came to Tesela in his lodge, and told him plainly that no good thing had ever yet come of a Chiricahua, trusting a pale man. Not once, not ever, and that his own daughter had no earthly business wearing a path between the camp and the very country of all their grief. Naishi's own aunt, her dead mother's sister, spoke against it longest and hardest of all, by the fire, in front of the others. And here is the one thing most worth your remembering about Eli Hartwell and about Naish, the very thing that made the two of them fit and ready for the ending they were slowly riding toward without knowing it, that they answered not one word of all that hard wind with argument. They did not climb up on the mercantile porch to shout down the gossips at their own game, and Naish did not quarrel and spit back at her aunt across the fire, for they had both of them learned somewhere in their separate hard lives that you cannot ever win a frightened person up out of their fear with words and heat, not ever, that you can only wear the fear slowly down with time and with patience, and with plain, undeniable proof, the exact way that running water wears down a standing stone, not by striking at it hard, but simply by never once stopping. So Eli just went on being precisely and stubbornly what he had always been, honest to the penny in the mercantile, square and fair with every man he dealt with, quick as ever to help a neighbor pull a breached calf in the cold or mend a downed fence, even a neighbor who had laughed at him openly the Sunday before. And Naish went on being just exactly what she was. And so it happened that when Fen's own young son took a bad pitching fall off a green half-broke colt that autumn, and lay senseless in his bed for 2 days with a leg swelled up black and tight, and the valley's own doctor 40 miles distant. It was Naisha's deep knowledge of the binding root, carried down the mountain in Eli's saddlebag on the back of that buckskin, that drew the terrible swelling down and saved the boy his leg and maybe his life. And Heavy Fen stood there in his own lamplit doorway afterward, with his hat crushed in his 2 hands, and could not for the life of him lift his eyes to meet the ranchers. Kindness, it turned out in the end, was the only argument that either of them ever troubled to make against all that fear, and it was a slow argument, and a patient one. And little by little, house by house and heart by heart, it was winning. When at last the frozen ground had thawed and softened, and the first tender green had come creeping back up into the high pastures, Eli Hartwell made up his mind to go and do the thing properly, in the old and honored way, the way that would do respect to her people and to her father, and not merely serve his own plain wanting. He did not think for a moment of stealing her away in the night, the way a rasher and more foolish young man might have done, and he did not send his question up ahead of him by another's mouth. But instead, he gathered together the very best that he had to offer, and it was not much at all, and that humbleness was precisely and exactly the whole point of it. He traded away 2 of his own lean cattle, which he could ill afford to lose, for a fine thick wool blanket dyed a deep rich red, and he brought a full sack of the last of the winter's stored sweet apples that the buckskin so loved, and that he had noticed with a pang the ragged children of the high camp had none of, and he brought a good horsehair bridle that he had braided himself slow and careful over many long lamplit evenings from the best leather he owned, and he brought a knife of fine true steel with a bone handle that had been his own dead father's before him, and was near the last thing of the man's he had left, and he loaded all of these carefully onto the golden horse, and he rode up the worn familiar path alone, in the clean bright light of a spring morning, with his heart going hard against his ribs. And when he came up into the wide ring of the camp, with the whole gathered band standing silent and watching, and the camp dogs barking and circling, and the small children running alongside the horse, he swung down out of the saddle, and he took off his wide hat and held it against his chest, and he stood there bareheaded and plain, before Chief Sella and all the gathered grave elders with his eyes lowered in respect to the ground, and through Naish, who stood trembling and pale at the very edge of the circle, with her hands pressed together, and with what halting few words of her own tongue he had managed to gather up across the long winter, he said his whole piece out loud. He said that he was a poor man, and that he knew it well, and would not pretend otherwise, that he had a hard, rocky ranch, and a lean small herd, and truly nothing at all to boast of before them, but that he had a whole and honest heart, and that it belonged now and entirely to Naish, and that he had come up the mountain in the sight of them all to ask for her, and that if she should be given to him, he would honor her and her people and their old ways all the days of his life, and would raise up their children to know both their bloods equally and to be ashamed before no man of either one, and that he would keep the path he had worn between the mountain and the valley open, and walked as long as ever he drew breath in his body. And then he knelt and laid down his humble gifts in the dust before the chief, and he stood back up, and he waited, his hat still in his 2 hands, in the long ringing silence that followed, the way a man waits at a graveside or before an altar, for the one word that would surely make him, or unmake him, for good. Tasela let the silence stretch and sit and settle, for he was a man who weighed a thing full and slow before ever he set his tongue to it, and he looked long and steady at the young rancher standing bareheaded and waiting in the middle of his camp with the golden horse cropping grass behind him, and then he let his dark eyes travel down and rest on the humble gifts laid out there in the dust. The braided bridle, and the plain sack of apples, and the fine old bone-handled knife, and he saw at once and clearly, as a wise man will, that this man had not brought up the mountain the richest things that he might somehow have bought or borrowed, but rather the very dearest things that he already owned. The last knife of a dead father. The sweetness saved back for children not his own. And that, Tasela knew well, was an altogether different and a far weightier matter, and he did not let it pass him by. Then the chief turned his gaze and looked for a long moment at his own aged mother, who sat wrapped even now in that same heavy rancher's coat by the low fire, the coat she had never given back and never would, and the old woman met her son's eyes and gave him one small, slow, deliberate nod. And then Tasela looked last and longest at his daughter's own face, at Naish standing trembling at the circle's edge, and what he read plainly written there told him everything a father ever truly needs to know about such a question. And when he finally spoke, he spoke slow and clear and deliberate, so that Naish could carry each of his words across the space to Eli. And he spoke not to the rancher alone, but out loud to the whole of his gathered people, to the cold-eyed elders, and to the aunt who had spoken so long against it, for he meant with this speaking to settle the whole matter for good and for all. "There is a rule," Tasela said into the quiet, "that my own father gave down to me, and that his father gave down to him before that. A rule far older than these new fences, and older by far than all the bad blood and trouble between our two peoples, and the rule is this: that you can never know the true and final measure of any man by his fine words, or by his wealth, or by the color that the sun has chosen to make him, but only and ever by the respect and the kindness that he shows in the hour when no one at all is watching him, and when no reward of any kind is promised him for it, for any man alive will be generous and open-handed when there is a clear profit in it for him to see. But only a truly good man will give away the one thing he loves the most in this world to a freezing stranger who can never in this life repay him a single thing for it, and will expect nothing back, and will tell no living soul that he did it. This man before us," said Selah, and here he lifted his open hand toward Eli, "this man gave away the best and finest horse in all his country, his own dead father's last gift into his hand, to save the lives of two women he had been taught since his cradle to fear and to hate. And then he turned and walked home through a killing snow, with no coat on his back, and asked us for nothing in return, not so much as our thanks. And I tell you that a man who will do such a thing as that is no stranger at all to be watched with cold eyes from the far edge of our fire." And then Chief Selah rose up slowly to his full height, and he walked forward across the whole wide ring of the camp in the sight of both peoples, for by then a good number of the valley folk had ridden up curious to the edge of the trees to see just how the thing would fall out, and the old chief reached out and laid both of his broad, weathered hands flat upon Eli Hartwell's two shoulders, and he called him son, out loud and plain for all to hear, first in his own tongue, and then again slow and careful in the rancher's, so that there could not be the smallest mistaking of it in any heart present, my son. And he said that a man who would give away the horse he loved best would surely not go without horses, not while Selah drew breath, and he made to Eli then and there a great gift of many, a whole small herd of good sure-footed mountain ponies to breed and cross with the golden buckskin, and to multiply and spread across his poor rocky pastures. And he gave to him, besides a lasting place among the people, and the freedom of their high-hidden water and their long memory, and he blessed the two young people standing there in the bright spring light with his own voice and his own hands, and so it was that the very thing the whole town had laughed itself sick over all that long winter turned in the space of a single spring morning into the thing that the whole valley would tell and retell for 50 years and more. They were married beneath the wide-spreading cottonwoods down by the creek, within easy sight of the low rise where Eli's own mother and father lay sleeping, in the green and living heart of that same spring, and it was a wedding such as that hard-divided country had never once in its history seen and would not soon see again. The cowboys came in their good, stiff Sunday shirts, scrubbed pink and awkward and holding their hats, and they stood clustered on the one side of the trampled grass. And the warriors came down out of the mountains in their finest beadwork and their whitest buckskin with feathers in their hair, and they stood on the other side. And for the whole of that first uneasy hour, the two sides eyed one another across the open ground the way they had eyed each other across the wire fences all their lives, and no man would be the first to cross. But there was roasted meat enough and to spare laid out for every soul there, and there was the old grandmother moving slow and smiling among them all with her steady murmured blessing, wearing still that same rancher's coat, and there was the sight of the gentle golden horse standing garlanded and patient down by the bright water, the living cause of it all. And slow as the winter thaw itself, the two wary sides began to loosen and blur and mingle into one single crowd gathered close around one long shared fire, passing the meat hand to hand and passing their stories back and forth in two tongues, with Naish and a laughing valley man doing their best to carry each joke across the gap. And by the falling of the evening, a cottonwood bend fiddler had his instrument out and was sawing a reel, while a young grinning warrior beat the time for him on a drum. And old Heavy Fen himself came forward shamefaced and gave the bride a good milk heifer for a wedding gift, and then stood off alone at the edge of the firelight and could not have rightly told you why his eyes had gone and filled with tears. But the truest and the deepest proof of the whole thing came only later, in the way that real proof in this life always seems to come, in hard trouble rather than in feasting and music. For the very next summer a terrible drought came down and settled its dry weight over the whole valley like a great flat hand pressed slowly down upon it, week upon cloudless week, with never so much as the shadow of rain. And the creeks cracked to hard-baked mud, and the good grass cured to gray tinder that crunched to dust underfoot, and the ranchers' cattle bawled their thirst day and night out on the dying flats, and men who had never once looked up toward that mountain with anything warmer than plain suspicion now found themselves looking up toward it in the raw desperation of men about to lose everything they had. And it was Naish who led them up, she and the old grandmother, up the hard-hidden trails to the secret springs the Apache had guarded for 100 years and never once spoken of to any pale man, cold sweet water tucked far back in the shadowed rock where no rancher had ever thought to look. And it was the sure-footed mountain ponies out of Tsela's wedding gift, the very increase of the one horse Eli had given away that snowy night, that carried the barrels of that saving water down the mountain and drove the failing thin cattle back up to the high hidden green when the whole low country had nothing left in it to give a living thing. The valley did not lose its herds that killing year, and every soul in it knew full well and exactly whom they had to thank for it. And the old blind fear that had drawn its hard line straight down the middle of that country for 2 full generations of men simply went out of it that summer like a long fever finally breaking in the night, quietly, and almost with a kind of relief, for it is a heavy and a wearying thing to go on being afraid of your own near neighbors, and it is a great and unlooked-for gladness to be given at last leave to stop. The very people who had mocked Eli Hartwell the loudest and the longest were the selfsame ones who came now to lean on him the hardest in their need, and he never once in his life threw a single one of the old cruel words back into their faces, for that was simply not the kind of man that he was, and no more was his wife the kind of woman who would ever trouble to keep such a bitter score against a soul. And so the years went rolling on after that, in the way that good years have of doing, quiet and full and one much like the last, and if you had ridden up that same valley some 20 years further on, you would have found there at the foot of the eastern ridge not a poor hardscrabble ranch of a dozen lean and hungry cattle, but a wide and thriving place of fine and famous horses. The get and the grandeur of that one golden buckskin crossed with Tsela's mountain ponies spread now shining across broad green well-watered pastures, and sought after, and paid for up and down the whole length of the territory. For it was said far and wide that the Hartwell horses carried the best blood of both peoples in their veins, and were gentled by the kindest and surest hands in all that country. And you would have found children there too, and then in their turn their children, brown-skinned and sun-gold and dark-haired all together, who could sit a horse before they could hardly walk upright, and who spoke the rancher's English tongue and the Apache tongue in the very same breath, and could not always rightly tell you themselves which of the two was which, and who thought nothing at all, nothing whatever, of the old hard line that had once cut that whole country clean in two, because to them, praise be, it had simply never once existed. Eli Hartwell grew old and gray and easy on that good land beside the same woman he had lifted up onto his father's horse in the falling snow, and Chief Selah came riding down often in the long golden evenings to sit a while on the porch with the sun that one hard winter had given him late in life, and the two men would watch the horses graze and say little and be content. And when at last the old chief died, full of years he was carried down and buried on the very same low rise as Eli's own mother and father, all of them lying together now above the Singing Creek, which tells you as plain and as sure as anything ever could just how far a single act of plain kindness can carry a man and his people down through the years. So let me leave you tonight with the one question that this whole long story was always quietly asking underneath, and let me ask it of you now straight and plain. Wherever in this wide world you happen to be watching and listening from tonight, when the hard cold comes down and the stranger stands shivering before you, and the easy thing is only to keep tight hold of what is yours and turn away, will you find in yourself the courage to give away the good thing you are holding? Not for any reward that you can name, and not for any thanks that you will ever hear, but only because it is right. Because that, friend, is the whole of it. That fear is forever building its fences, and kindness is forever wearing them patiently down, and a man who gives away the one horse he loves may just find himself a father, and a family, and a whole wide valley made new and green again. If this old story has warmed you tonight, tell me down in the comments where in this world you are riding along from, for I do love to know it, and do me that one small kindness of tapping the like button and subscribing to Saddleback Stories, and ringing that bell so I can meet up with you again down the trail by the next fire. Until then, ride easy, friend, and be the one who gives.